This is a record of wind variability in the control area of E.ON, a large wind farm operator in Europe. This record of wind electricity input to the grid in 2004 shows that it varied continually from 0.2% to as high as 38% of daily peak grid load. Because of the variability shown, the average electricity delivered ranges from 1/4 to 1/3 of the installed capacity. Because of the intermittent nature of wind, electricity generated by wind power cannot stand alone. It always requires a helper. When the wind speed drops below 4 meters per second, exceeds 25 meters per second, or the temperature is too cold, the turbines stop turning and the helper must supply all of the electricity. Therefore, the helper must be large enough to supply all peak load electricity. It cannot be smaller when supplemented by wind electricity. Some of the energies required to manufacture electricity, such as fossil fuels and hydro, can be stored and used to make electricity as needed. However, wind cannot be stored for future use. It must be used to make electricity when it is available. Because large-scale electricity storage is not possible, production and consumption is balanced on a knife edge of supply and demand. At any given moment, only enough electricity is produced to exactly equal the amount being consumed. Wind cannot deliver power when needed because the wind blows only intermittently. This is a serious limitation because it does not interface well with human energy use patterns, which require electricity to be available when needed. Thus, wind is always coupled with a reliable source of generating electricity, such as a fossil fuel or hydro-powered generating station. Wind electricity is always less than 10% of the electricity delivered by the reliable source of energy. Why this limitation? Simply because too much variability in electricity flow into the grid can cause it to become unstable, either whole or in part, and shut down. We know this from practical experience in Europe and the US. The capacity of the reliable source must always be large enough to supply the full peak electricity demand because wind electricity can stop at any time. Thus, wind electricity requires a duplication of generating facilities, but can save up to 10% of fossil fuel and carbon emissions, or water stored behind a dam. This is one reason why wind will always be a small contributor to world energy supply. The boilers burning fossil fuels to make steam for turbines to generate electricity are very large and cannot be quickly shut down or started up. When wind electricity is supplied to replace the electricity generated by the fossil fuel system, the fuel flow to the boilers is reduced but not stopped, and the generators continue to turn, but no electricity is produced. The system is in spinning reserve mode. Fuel is being burned, carbon is being emitted, no electricity is produced, but, importantly, the system is ready to deliver electricity the instant the wind electricity flow stops. In other words, wind does not completely displace the fuel required for its helper. Spinning reserve mode is something like having your foot on the brake of your car while waiting at a red light. Your car doesn't move, but the engine is still running. And the engine must run, because when the light turns green, you need the power immediately. Unfortunately, just like your car at a stoplight, spinning reserve mode consumes energy. As we saw earlier, wind electricity can supply up to 10% of the energy that is supplied by its helper and saves up to 10% of the fuel. However, because of spinning reserve mode, the fuel saving is somewhat less. In other words, even with the maximum wind electricity, overall the fossil fuel plant still releases more than 90% of the carbon dioxide than it would without wind power. Hydro as a helper has the same 10% limitation as fossil fuels. Continually changing wind electricity flow results in continually changing river flows. On the positive side, wind can save up to 10% of water behind a dam. On the Canada wind map, the best wind land is shown in turquoise or above on the scale and is far from where most people live. There is another limitation of wind power. There is not much available where it is needed. The situation is similar in the United States. The best wind land is far from where electricity is needed. Wind electricity is inherently difficult and would be rarely used were it not for generous tax breaks. In the United States, 2/3 of the value of a wind energy project comes from federal tax breaks. The situation in Canada is similar. For example, Hydro-Quebec is studying proposals to buy wind electricity at 6.5 cents per kilowatt hour, plus 1.3 cents per kilowatt hour for integration and connection, plus 0.9 cents per kilowatt hour for balancing, for a total of 8.7 cents per kilowatt hour delivered to a substation. Hydro-Quebec cost for hydroelectricity is 2.8 cents per kilowatt hour, or about 1/3 that of wind electricity. In Germany in 2004, E.ON Netz, a large wind farm operator in Europe, was paid 9 per kilowatt hour, which is equivalent to 13 cents Canadian per kilowatt hour. You've mentioned a 10% limit. However, it's regularly reported that countries such as Denmark produce up to 20% of their electricity by wind power.
There are so many misleading statements about wind power. Firstly, it is true that about 20% of Denmark's electricity is supplied by wind power. This appears to be greater than the 10% upper limit, but is actually much below. Denmark's wind electricity is about 2% of the Nordel system overall electricity output, of which Denmark is a part, along with Norway, Sweden, and Finland.
What do you see as the biggest misleading statement in the wind power debate?
It is often said that wind can supply electricity for, say, 100,000 houses. The fact is that wind cannot supply electricity to even one house unless it has a reliable helper. The fact that a reliable helper is required is rarely, if ever, mentioned. If wind electricity exceeds 10% of the helper, the system becomes unstable and shuts down. The helper cannot be smaller because it must supply all of the electricity when the turbines shut down, which they do when the wind is too slow, too fast, or too cold. Wind power is inherently difficult to use because it is intermittent and erratic, and there are no really good ways to store large quantities of electricity. In the past, a good application in rural areas was for pumping water. A correctly sized water tank could be filled in times of good wind, and it would last through calm periods to the next good wind. Nevertheless, there are good small niche applications for wind power in remote areas with very high diesel fuel costs, good wind resource, and small enough for battery storage as the helper. There are realistic constraints preventing wind power from growing significantly. Wind power is remote and requires lots of land. 20,000 square kilometers per exajoule of electricity produced. Turbines must be spaced apart by 10 times their rotor diameter. Otherwise, they will steal each other's wind. Even if it were possible to provide all U.S. electricity for 2003 from wind power, it would require an area of good wind land equal to a corridor from New York to Chicago, a distance of about 1,150 kilometers and about 200 kilometers wide. Over the long term, wind electricity may well be a temporary phenomenon. If there were some reason to reduce the generous subsidies, then interest in wind power is sure to wane. The key point of this analysis is that wind power is a small energy source now for very good technical reasons and always will be.
Solar electricity, like wind, cannot stand alone and has the same intermittency problems. Large-scale generation of solar electricity connected to a grid would require spinning reserve mode as a backup for the effects of clouds and nightfall. Very often, the concept of net metering is proposed as a means of adding solar electricity to the grid. Net metering is where people with solar power panels on their home can sell their excess electricity to the public utility and simply buy it back when they need it. In effect, this exploits the public electricity infrastructure as a giant battery. However, the flow of electricity to and from the utility is completely unpredictable as people turn on hair dryers, stoves, etc. at random times. This variability, together with changing cloud cover, limits the total contribution of solar to the grid to up to 10% of annual electricity production. Large-scale solar requires much dedicated land. For example, in Tucson, Arizona, which averages the most sunlight in the U.S., 2,000 square kilometers of land is required to produce 1 exajoule of electricity, which is less than 2% of world electricity demand. Sites near Seattle or Montreal would require 3 times the land area for the same annual electricity output because of lower sun angle and less solar radiation. Just finding 2,000 square kilometers or more of land suitable for large arrays of photovoltaic cells in Arizona is not easy, nor is 6,000 square kilometers near Seattle or Montreal. The land must be non-remote, have helper electricity supply nearby, and be horizontal or slightly tipped southward with no nearby features to cause shadows. The land must be suitable for roads between solar arrays for regular cleaning of the surfaces and other maintenance. Suitable land is prime land and is already occupied and being well used. Solar electricity is excellent for many small niche applications where batteries can be used to store electricity for future use. Renewable energies are usually considered to be desirable sources of energy because they are natural and inexhaustible. There are positive and valuable aspects to each renewable energy. However, every renewable energy has a land footprint and a footprint on the environment. This slide shows graphically the land footprint area required to produce 1 megawatt of electricity from various primary energy sources. Biomass fuels, such as wood and liquid fuels from corn, switchgrass, etc., is a land hog for the amount of energy it produces. That is why it is small and will remain small. Although wind power is more land efficient, it exerts a strong ecological footprint. A range of groups oppose new installations of wind turbines and press for removal of others. The winds that attract wind power installations are often migratory routes for birds, which are often killed by turbine blades. Tip speeds of the blades approach 300 kilometers per hour. Vibrations transmitted through the ground and noise from the blades passing the tower annoy people living nearby. Objections to wind turbines in scenic locations are becoming more common. Ocean tidal energy is remote, intermittent, and small, and will remain small. Solar energy provided by photovoltaic solar cells is an improvement in land intensity for equal energy output, but as we have seen, it has other limits. Solar thermal energy consists of mirrors focusing the reflection of the sun on a centralized location, which heats up to produce steam to generate electricity. Although it requires slightly less land per unit of energy output, it is geographically limited. Volcanic geothermal energy requires very little land per unit of output.